Watercolour versus gouache. What is the difference? Hi folks, welcome to my channel. I'm Sarah, and in today's video I'll be talking a bit about the differences and similarities between water and gouache. And whilst I'm doing that, I'm going to paint two tiger pictures so you can see how they compare side by side. For this demonstration I'll be using Winsor and Newton's Professional watercolours in tubes and Winsor and Newton's gouache, also in tubes. This video is not sponsored, but I will list the details of the materials I use in the description box. So if you like this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, why not subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon as well so you don't miss out on future videos. But before I begin the tiger paintings, I just thought I'd swatch out one colour of each gouache and watercolour, and I've picked cadmium orange to run through some of the main characteristics. Now, watercolour and gouache can both be mixed or diluted with water, but watercolour is known more as a transparent medium. It's made up largely of pigment particles with a binder, which is usually gum arabic. Cheaper brands may also contain a filler and less pigment as a result. And as you add more water to watercolour, the lighter it gets, giving you the option of lovely luminous washes and smooth gradients. Gouache, on the other hand, is opaque, which is the opposite of transparent. So, as well as pigment particles and gum in its makeup, it also contains something like zinc or titanium oxide. This gives it its opacity. It can be duller and more matte in appearance as a result. However, you can use it like watercolour just by diluting it with more water, but in my opinion you don't get the same luminosity of colour, and if you're going to do this, you may as well just use watercolour. Gouache is designed to be used thicker, and to make the most of its bright flat colour, it's great for blocking out large areas. And whilst you can still use the same wet in wet or wet in dry techniques for both, watercolour as a fairly slow drying medium seems to be more versatile and lends itself more to using special effects than its faster drying friend gouache, with its opaque, more matte finish. So when it comes to lifting, watercolour and gouache both lift well, though in this demonstration the watercolour did seem to lift more easily, but that may be because it was still damp and the gouache had already dried when I tried to lift it off. So right now you may be wondering why anyone would choose gouache. Well, let me demonstrate white gouache. Now, gouache is designed to be used thicker. With watercolour you need to work in light layers and preserve the white of the paper, working light to dark. Gouache is different. With gouache you can work light to dark, but you can also layer light on top of dark, meaning you can erase errors, add white highlights, change your mind, and that is something you can't do with watercolour. Once you've lost the white of the paper, it's gone. And even if you can lift, you can never get back completely to the white of the paper. So you can use gouache like watercolour just by diluting it, and you can also use watercolour like gouache by adding gouache. But if you want to try special effects like adding salt and so on, I'd save it for watercolours. So let's move on to the painting demonstration. On the left hand side I'm going to be doing a watercolour painting, and on the right a gouache painting. So I've already done a rough outline sketch of two tigers on a piece of cold pressed watercolour paper, and this outline is just done with a light pencil. So I'm going to attempt to paint these pretty much the same so that we can see the difference between watercolour and gouache, and I've had to speed it up a bit because otherwise we'd be here a fairly long time. Now straight away you can see that the wet in wet technique was used for both paintings, and the gouache seemed to come out really bright, really vibrant, and I was also able to do some lifting on that side as well. Bearing in mind though that on the watercolour side I always had the opportunity and the potential to add more layers, where with gouache it's not as easy to layer. Sometimes when you add layers onto gouache, it can blur the paint that you've added underneath, so you kind of get a bit of a muddy mess. But in any case, I was quite pleased with the background as it was. It just meant that I didn't really have that as an option. Adding water onto gouache, if I wanted to do another layer, can also blur and smear the colours. But back onto the watercolour side, and my original plan was to do a little bit of each, and as the watercolour dried I would do some of the gouache painting and vice versa. However, it's been really warm in the UK lately and I found that the watercolour paper was drying really quickly, so I ended up doing mostly all of the watercolour piece and then moving on to the gouache. But in any case, you can still see the comparisons. So on the watercolour side, I started out with the lighter colours and gradually built up layers. And I really like this about watercolour. It gives you a nice bit of flexibility. You can go darker if you want, but the one thing you do have to be careful is to preserve the white of the paper, because as much as you can lift colour, you can never get it quite back to the white of the paper. And that is going to be your lightest colour. So you haven't really got an option, as you have with gouache, of layering on top of it. Not with watercolour at least. So I built up gradually the layers, being careful to leave the white in the eye for the reflection, and moving round the painting, allowing certain areas to dry whilst I built up other areas. I really like about watercolour that you can get these nice transitions, you can get nice gradients, and that you can layer colours as well. So for this painting I did go in with sort of lighter areas first, where sometimes I would often go in and do the darkest area first, but for this demonstration I did try and go light to dark, just to make that illustration that is the best way to work for watercolour. It's not the only way, and obviously you work whichever way suits you, but it does give you then the flexibility of building up layers gradually. But if you want to mark in the dark areas first, that's fine. It just means that you can't then go lighter. Sometimes it's easier to mark in the dark areas first, and then you can kind of map out where you're going to go. But I kind of like going in with the lighter areas first. I tended to switch between several small brushes, and that enabled me to get the details of the fine hairs around the eye area. And another thing that you can do with watercolour that you can't do so well with gouache is to use of washes and glazes, so more dilute mixes of paint and water, and then you can sort of change the colour of your painting just by doing that light glaze over the top. Now the paper I've used is cold pressed on this painting, and I have done a little bit of research which suggests that gouache perhaps works better on hot press paper, but I read that after I've already started doing my pencil drawing. So if you've used gouache before and you've tried it on hot press paper and you find any differences, then do let me know in the comments box. I have done a couple of gouache paintings before, but at the moment I've really been loving watercolours just because of their luminosity and vibrancy, and I've just been really enjoying them. It's a while since I've used gouache, so if you've got any comments or tips even, then do share them with us all and we can all benefit. It's also worth mentioning that I didn't spend overly long on either piece because I wanted to get this all sort of done and dusted today so that you could have the video today. Been a bit behind this week with things just because it's half term and schools are out and all that, so what I would normally do is go over my piece at the end, possibly with some colour pencil and some fine liners, just to add a few more details and perhaps fine hairs and that kind of thing, but for this demonstration I didn't do that. But I was quite pleased at how it came out. I think it does need a bit more detail on the left side of the face, but as I said, that would be something that I could go in and finish off with a little bit more time. I really enjoy with watercolour the way that you can add different colours and they can blend really nicely on the paper as well. It adds to a different dimension to your painting and makes everyone unique. So I was able to mix in some yellows and some greens even with the oranges that I'd laid down for the colours in his coat. So moving on to the gouache side, to start with I was a bit anxious about how this was going to turn out, but actually it was really quite nice to have the freedom that if I did anything wrong or that if I did a mistake, then I could use the white gouache to go over and not quite erase the mistake, but at least cover up a lot of it. So I tended to work quite a bit quicker on this side and started off, instead of from light to dark, from dark to light. So I put in all those darkest areas first and used that as a map to guide me of where the other areas were and what colours to use. It also gave a good starting point for contrast to help balance out the piece as a whole. I was then able to go in with quite a dark brown instead of building up to this colour from a light layer as I did on the watercolour. So I'm still adding water to my gouache, but I'm using it a little bit more thickly than I did with the watercolour. So the differences with watercolour, as we discussed briefly at the beginning, were that it's not as easy to glaze, because if you try and do this, then the colours underneath reactivate and you can end up with a bit of a muddy colour. So with watercolours, the colours do tend to stay a lot more luminous and less likely to dull. But it was really nice to be able to go in and layer over the darker colours with lighter colours, and you'll see this in a bit when I go in with the white gouache. So you can still build up those layers, but the white gouache is a real game changer. It's so opaque and so good at covering up the layer underneath. As you can see close up, I was able to add in all those sort of like fine details and hairs and things, and it really worked well and helped bring this piece to life. You can also mix it in with your browns and get lighter colours and have them cover up the layers underneath as well. So as much as it's said that they're not as easy to blend, I think you can add some really nice special effects, and those layers and the fact that you can use dark over light really helps make that piece bright and stand out. So watercolour and gouache are quite similar in a lot of ways, but this white gouache is a real game changer. Used straight out of the tube, it's really easy to add highlights and fine details like fur or hairs, and there's nothing to stop you using it on your watercolour pieces as well, and I've been doing this for quite some time now. So this is something that you can't get with watercolour white. Watercolour white is not very good as far as I'm concerned, and I would choose white gouache for doing this every time. But let me know what you think. Have you used watercolour or gouache before, and which do you prefer? I think I still prefer watercolour, just because you can get those lovely gradients and layers and all that kind of stuff. They're so bright and luminous. I love watercolours, but I'd love to know what you prefer. I'd probably use gouache for my sketchbook or something like that because it dries easily. But what do you think of the finished paintings? Which do you prefer? Let me know if you like this video. give it a thumbs up, comment and subscribe to my channel. Here are some more videos that you might like, and I will catch you all in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.